Hi, Bonner. Your son Mark asked me if I'd send along some memories, and I thought I'd do it on video here. And I thought I'd do it in black and white because most memories show up in black and white, right? I want to tell you a little bit about the time that you and I went out to Elko to the Cowboy Poetry Festival. You may remember that. I was interested in cowboy poetry and kind of having some fun with it, and we decided that instead of going to the Heber Festival, I think we'd missed the Heber Festival, which we caught a couple of times after that. We decided to drive out to Elko, and we stayed at the Oak Tree Inn, which was where the rail cruise for the railroad stayed. Maybe that was the only place in town we could get in, and then we got some late tickets and saw some really good, fine cowboy poets say their thing. One night at Elko, we wanted to go to the kind of famous sheep herders inns. There are 3 of them there in Elko, and you can sit there and have a family-style dinner around a table with strangers, some of whom are supposed to be Basque sheep herders, and most of them turned out to be tourists, but it was kind of a fun thing for us to do. Hope you remember this. And we drove over there, and we looked for a place to park, and there were 3 houses, and there was parking in abundance in front of those houses, but everywhere else was filled. There was no place to park, and so we drove around the block a couple of times, and we decided to park in front of those houses. And we got out. It was light, and we walked 2 or 3 blocks over to this guest house where we had a reservation. We had a wonderful dinner. But during the dinner, we learned that it was very hard to get parking, and we mentioned that we found parking in front of these 3 houses, and a few people snickered and said, well, most people don't like to park in front of those houses. And so on the way back, we went right up to our car and kind of got in. As we got in, we realized that by then it was dark, and that there was a little sign in each one of those 3 houses that said open. And we later learned that that was kind of the red light district for Elko. And I always wondered what it would be like if somebody had seen us from BYU, both working at BYU at the time, with our car parked in front of the Houseville Repute in Elko. In any case, that was kind of fun, but the one thing I remember the most about that trip is that there was Waddy Mitchell, of course, kind of introduced all the programs, and in one of the programs he gave a poem that you really, really liked, and I looked it up, found it, and wanted to memorize it for the trip home. And I am so bad at memorizing things. And so it took me a couple of years to memorize it. That's how slow I am. But it's from Bruce Kaskatian. And Bruce Kaskatian, you may recall, was a real cowboy on the old Chisholm Trail. And when he got too old to run the trail and be a cowboy anymore, he got a job in Los Angeles, California, as a bellman at the Hollywood Hotel. And he would carry the bags of Roy Rogers and Tom Mix and some of the early famous movie cowboys and tell them what it was like to be a real cowboy. And over time, they encouraged him to take his poetry and have it published. It wasn't until 20, 30, 40 years after he had created this poetry that it was actually put to paper, that it was all in his head. And the poem you liked, as I recall, the most, that Waddy Mitchell gave, and he can do it a lot better than I can, was called The Bronco Peeler's Prayer, and it was by Bruce Kaskatian, and this is how it goes. It was just a little graveyard on the lonely foothill plains, bleached by sun and summer and drenched by winter snows and rains. And there were just a couple of settlers gathered on an autumn day around a homemade lumber coffin with their last respects to pay. These were weary men who wrung their living from this tired and arid land, and beside them stood their women, faded wives with toiled, worn hands. But among us stood a figure who was wiry, straight, and trim. Everyone knew him. He was the Bronco Peeler, Jim. Just a bunch of hardened muscle, tempered with a savage grit. He had the reputation of a man who wouldn't quit. He had helped to pay for the coffin. He had helped to dig the grave. His instincts must have told him how he was supposed to behave. Well, we didn't have a bishop, and the crowd was mighty slim, just two women with weak voices sang an old-time funeral hymn. That's all we had for service. The old wife was sobbing there for her husband of a lifetime, laid to rest without a prayer. And then she saw the bronco peeler, and she walked right up to him and put one trembling arm around him and said, "Pray. Please, won't you, Jim?" Well, you could see his figure straighten and a look of quick surprise work across his swarthy features and his hard, daredevil eyes. He could tackle any bronco, and he never backed down from a fight. That was the first time anyone had ever seen his face turn white. But then he took his old sombrero off his rough and shaggy head. How I wish I could remember what that bronco peeler said. No, he wasn't educated. On the plains his youth was spent. But the maker of creation knew exactly what he meant. He looked over to the mountains where the distant shadows played. Silence must have reigned in heaven when they heard the way Jim prayed. When the words had all been spoken, the grave had all been filled, he got on his half unbroken pony and he rode up to the hills, and we just stood there and let him. We watched him ride away. There's no words that we could say to thank him. There's nothing we could say. Years have passed while since we gathered in that graveyard, in that only lonely graveyard spot. But it gave us all a memory and a lot of food for thought, how we stood there beside this coffin and some freshly broken sod and a reckless bronco peeler talking heart to heart with God. Since we gathered at the graveyard, it's been 50 years, with our joys and our sorrows and our hopes and our fears. But I hope when I'm finished and they've laid me with the dead, some cowboy says a prayer over me like that bronco peeler said. That's become my favorite poem too, and I hope you like it. I did finally memorize it, and thanks for sitting here and listening to me say it. I've listened to you and your stories a few times. Thanks for indulging me. Love you, Bonner. Take care.